Welcome to Fox 23's Frigid, where we take a deep dive with a keen eye into cold cases across the state of Oklahoma. I am joined today by psychologist Dr. Maggie Zingman. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is always such a gift to be able to tell our story.
Well, I am so lucky to be speaking with you today. We are discussing a case that Fox 23 has discussed before out of Tulsa, your daughter, Brittany Phillips. So Brittany Phillips was 18 years old when she was found in her apartment. She had been murdered in 2004. She had recently graduated high school and moved out on her own, ready to take the world by storm, but her future was taken away from her, and her loved ones were left questioning who would ever want to hurt Brittany. Brittany's mom, Maggie, has spent 2 decades now looking for Brittany's killer and met with Fox 23 late last year around what would have been Brittany's 39th birthday to discuss her daughter's case and what she's still been doing to help solve it. So Maggie, first of all, let's start by talking about Brittany. Who is she?
Okay. Well, Brittany from birth was energetic, adventurous. I mean, by year 2, we called her middle name was Accident because she would jump off things, fall into pools. I mean, she just enjoyed life.
Fearless.
And stuff. Yeah, definitely. She was empathetic, and this came through all the way till she was murdered, because many of her friends, after she was murdered, came to me and said, I knew Brittany in school. I wasn't part of the group, nor was she, but she looked like she'd be part of a popular group. And she would help me with my chemistry or help me with studies or just help me out because I was having a hard day. And, that was Brittany. What we worry sometimes is maybe that kindness she put out to somebody who ended up killing her. But that intelligence was another aspect of her because of when she started kindergarten, she was always a year younger than everybody, but she was always a top student. And so her senior year at Union High School, she got a chemistry scholarship.
Wow.
And, it was so great. So she applied, actually, to my alma mater, Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida, and she got a scholarship with them. So she got a full-ride scholarship in chemistry to go to Eckerd College. And when I drove her down there in September of 2003, that's when I was worried about her. Mm-hmm. That's when I thought, I'm not going to be able to know what she's doing. I'm not going to be able to check on her in the middle of the night if I have a weird feeling or anything. And I can remember looking at her in my rearview mirror and crying and just thinking this was the most heartbreaking time in my life. But because she was a year younger than everybody, after her freshman year, she decided to come home and come back to Tulsa and be near me, her brother, and her old friends. And so she moved into apartments right next to Union High School. And many people back then might know it. It was called Glen Eagles. Mm-hmm. 2 years after she was murdered, and we have some feelings about why, it was changed to Somerset Park at Union. And it was only, she came home maybe in June or July of 2004, and then she was killed late September, and we can talk about more later about the specific dates, but she hadn't even been home that long, and she was starting to go to Tulsa Junior College because she wanted to go to OSU, where I had graduated with my master's and PhD, but she needed, because Eckerd was a private college, she needed some more credits, so she was filling them, and she was working, she was supporting herself in that apartment. So she was always intelligent, kind, empathetic. One story that just might make sense to people is that recently, one story that is a good example, whose anniversary we just passed, is I've been a trauma-focused psychologist for about 37 years, longer than Brittany's murder. And I'm a first responder, and so I've done tornadoes, everything else. But in '95, I was called to do the Oklahoma City bombing. And the first couple of times I went up there, I was working with nurses. I was working with nurses and first responders. But then I started working on overseeing their crisis line, because it was the first time in the U.S. that we had first responders coming from other states, and they were going home, and they couldn't get people to understand what they had seen here, Right. And so they were calling us back going, what am I supposed to do? And so I was manning the phones. But at that point, because she wouldn't be exposed to anything. She came up with me a couple of times, and it was the first time that we had those fences where everybody now puts, stuffed animals, flowers, and, she was just crying when she brought up one of her teddy bears, and then the next time she came up, she was smiling and putting another one of her teddy bears, and of course I worked through it. But that was just, she was only, I'd have to do the math, but she was probably around 8 or 9, and to just have that empathy even then. And she was always that way, intelligent, empathetic, and of course I'm prejudiced, but I think if you look at her pictures, she was beautiful.
She was gorgeous. So that has to be so hard. I mean, the whole situation is difficult, obviously, and I can't even fathom what you've went through the past 21 years, but that's so difficult. How did you cope with that? Because there's almost that hard understanding that if she wouldn't have came home, would this situation have happened?
Correct. And, as a trauma psychologist, I became one because of my own PTSD when I was in my 20s and 30s. And I didn't believe you could get better, and people who helped me to get better made me want to go into this field. So I had some skills, but those first couple of years were really hard. And it took me a minute. And I still grieve. I mean, grieving is what you'll do. You just learn how to carry it differently. But what I remembered and what I worked through, and now what I help other homicide families is a lot of times if you live in the if-onlys, if only I had, asked her, told her she couldn't come home, if only when I called her the first night, which we'll talk about, if I had thought something was wrong and gone down there. If you live in the if-onlys, you can't heal.
Right.
So I had to purposely work on not blaming myself, not torturing myself. And then, like many people, back then, I thought that life was like CSI, because we found her and stuff, and within 2 or 3 weeks they told me they had DNA, and I thought, oh, it'll be solved. Here we are at 20 years. And those are the things. It's not what happened to her, but it's more some of the dynamics of the whole criminal justice system that are they've been affecting me, but I have to look at them the same way. If I let her murder or her murderer or even the shutdown of the police take away my joy of life, then they're winning, any one of them.
Right.
So it's really hard. And the other thing, you always have to walk towards the grief. A lot of people try to do things to move away. As you know, I have her face on my car since 2007. So I always say, I step into it. I look at her through what I say is a veil of tears. And then I get excited to think about all the things that maybe she's helped impact the change. But you have to let yourself grieve all the time. You have to let yourself scream. And even though there's no answer to why, every once in a while you have to go, why?
Right. So, obviously...
Just one quick thing. If I go on too long, do this.
Absolutely not. No, this is what we're here for.
Okay.
We want to chat with you and about your experience and about Brittany. And obviously she seemed close with her family. She wanted to come home. And she was into a lot of different things. And she seemed very bright. But that life was cut short. And on September 30th, 2004, police showed up at Brittany's apartment around 61st and Mingo, and when they entered her home, they found Brittany dead. Just a few days later, on October 4th, Brittany would have turned 19, but instead she was buried. Is that why on her headstone it says October 4th to October 4th?
Yes, because I talked to Brittany at 9 p.m. on September 27th, and then on September 28th and September 29th, I called her. I didn't think anything about her not answering because she was late at school. Mm-hmm. And then Thursday night, I called her and said, Brittany, I know you're okay, but this is your mom. Just let me know. Because there had been other times that she didn't call, and I found out she was okay.
Yeah,
she was a teenager.
Right. I was like, was it normal for her to go a few days without checking in?
Yeah,
Or...
especially if I had done something that upset her, but I didn't, because when I talked to her Monday, it was because she had been at the junior college. She saw her brother. She was with a friend. She went to an aftercare because she had all these sinus problems, and she couldn't get in. She was there 2 hours, and she called me upset like a little girl, crying, saying, and I was working and living in Chandler because I had just got a home there because I was working at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center. And so I said, well, you're coming up this weekend, we'll get together, I'll get you a doctor and stuff. And so what the medical examiner said back then, because it may have changed now, is that she probably died sometime between September 27th at 9 p.m. and September 28th at 8 a.m. So we didn't know when she died. She got called. Somebody checked the apartment on the 30th because the friend that she went to school with was trying to find why she wasn't at school Thursday night, or the night before, but she went there on Thursday the 30th.
Yeah, I was curious why the police showed up in the first place.
So they showed up because she went there. Something looked strange. I think she saw the door open, but there were also lights on. And so she just felt like something was weird, and she called out, and Brittany didn't answer. So her father, the girlfriend's father, was a DA in, I don't know, one of the North counties. And she called him. He said, get them to do a wellness check. So the people who were called for the wellness check initially was my daughter's best friend's father, who was then a police officer. And he and his partner had been called to come and do a wellness check. And luckily they got called off because for the last 10 years, Brittany and her friend had been staying up at her friend's house or my house, and her father had watched Brittany grow up. So if he had come in to do that wellness check, he would have found her murdered. But then supposedly that's when the police found her murdered. And because I had moved, they didn't have my address. Tulsa police had 2 chaplains, 2 officers, came to where my son was living, notified him. I was expecting a friend in Chandler to come in from Chicago, and at 1 a.m. on October 1st, I got a knock on the door. And I opened the door, and it's like out of a movie when you think back to it, because there was a big storm, the wind, and there was this very young sheriff in a raincoat, and he goes, "Are you Maggie Zingman?" And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Here, you need to call Jeff Felton, Tulsa Police. Your daughter's been murdered."
Oh, my goodness.
And then he vanished into the dark. I mean, so needless to say, you go back to that question about how do you handle this. Part of the process of my healing has been, especially back then, because people know better now, but teaching police departments about informing families about now what we call trauma-informed care.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because doctors, nurses, anybody in the medical field has to be taught how to have bedside manner. You would think people that are dealing in law enforcement would also kind of have to have
Well,
that.
yeah, and even Tulsa police back then and even now, they do have it on the immediate crimes that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
My big issue and what I've been fighting with Tulsa police now is they don't have trauma-informed care for the cold cases. And even the city council about 4 years ago mandated that the Tulsa police needed to do informed cares, and that's why we have teams that go out now. Their interview rooms are better. All this for the immediate crimes is great, but families with cold cases, it's why I have like a pin like this, and I have a lot of things that I promote about this, saying cold cases aren't dead cases. Don't leave us in the cold, because missing, there's still a chance that they're alive. A crime that's just happened, there's a hope that you're going to solve it. But cold cases, it's just sometimes. And part of the trauma-informed care is communication. But I'm probably going way off on tangents there. But
No, I mean, that it makes so much sense. And that's, to hear something so awful happen to your daughter and it to be that information given to you in such a cold and abrupt way. I mean, that's hard.
It's very hard, and it makes a person go, where am I? Who am I? After he left, I was like, no, they're mistaken. And I'm falling back against, I had stairs in that home, and I fell back against the stairs, and I'm sitting there going, because when this happens, it disorients you. And I went, who should I call? I don't know if I can drive to Tulsa myself because I was in Chandler. Should I call my parents? I don't want to wake my parents up. I don't want to wake my family up. Who should I call? And, that's just because it seems so unreal. But, of course, my family was in New York and California. Of course, I called them, and it devastated. And I called my best friend because she had watched Brittany grow up. And so she came up there, and she and her husband drove halfway, down there with me. But, again, my caretaker, because I'd already been working in this field 15 years, knowing that my friend Carol had watched Brittany grow up, I said, you can't go in there with me. I don't want you to go in there with me,
That's so showing of your character, too, because that's your daughter, and you've already talked about 2 other people that you were worried about their reaction to your daughter's death. Yeah. I mean, that explains why you're in the field that you're in. But, you were worried about, her best friend's father who watched Brittany grow up. And then you're worried about, your friend that watched Brittany grow up and not wanting them to have to handle that grief. And you're handling it.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, because sometimes you worry about others so you don't have to think about yourself, But, yeah, and so, I did end up driving myself down there. But even driving myself down there, and again, this goes back to what I was saying before, if I sort of stayed in that mode, if only they had notified me better. Or when I got to the place, to her apartment, I walked in and she had 2 of our cats. I was going to move up, and they were on the couch. And this officer comes out of the bedroom and he goes, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Brittany's mom. Can I see her?" He goes, "She was already taken." Mm. And I said, "How could that be?" Because CSI, I thought, he said, "We identified her by the license and stuff." And so that was a progression of steps later where I never got to see her. If I had survived, and initially it devastated me. I mean, I remember at the funeral director when I was saying goodbye to her before we put her in the casket, I remember asking if I could see her, and the funeral director said, no, you can't see her. She's been autopsied, and we don't want you to, that's going to be shocking. And I said to him, and later to some people I was training, I said, we're already shocked the first time when you tell me my daughter's been murdered. But I didn't have enough of a voice then, so I went out screaming into the parking lot. My sister had to come after me because I was like, I have to at least see her. And, he wouldn't let me see her. So the way I said goodbye to my daughter was her body was there, but he had a green cloth, I still can remember it, over her face and her upper chest. And all I could do was that little nose that she had that gave her so many problems is whenever she was upset, I would put her head on my lap and I'd take my finger and go along her nose just like this. And, that's how I said goodbye to her. And I just laid my head on her stomach and I said, I'm sorry, Brittany. I'm sorry.
So you never saw her face?
I mean, I did see pictures later, but that's different. But again, for a couple of years, I was like, why couldn't I? I'm never going to be able to heal. And I have met so many families who say that, who go, if I only could have said goodbye, if I only could have hugged her one last time, I'd be better. But that's where I've learned now as a trauma psychologist and just having been doing this 20 years is, it doesn't make anything better because they're already gone. I always say, and I truly live by this, is that you have to learn to live in spite of, because of, and in honor of, and walking towards it all the time. Because if you do stuff to avoid it, it's always back there, just chasing after you. And that's more torture than anything else.
Yeah. So After investigating, police determined that Brittany was most likely sexually assaulted and strangled. It's been nearly 21 years, and I'm sure hearing that never gets easier. Mm-hmm. How do you cope knowing that that's how your daughter went?
Again, I just have to carry it, because I guess, well, there's one thing, and it still sort of hits in my heart. Whenever Brittany was having a problem, like one time she was at a concert and the crowds just sort of crunched in. It was just downtown, around Greenwood and stuff. And I was out there waiting to pick them up, and all of a sudden my son called me, and he said, "Brittany's in an ambulance." And I went, "What?" And she had been pushed in by the crowd, and so she started having a panic attack. And when she had panic attacks, and she was about 17 then, she would always go, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," like a little 5-year-old. And so the one thing that sometimes comes into my brain is my fear that when she died, she was going, "Yeah, mommy." The only saving grace is Jeff Felton, who was our great detective until 2012, said, it looks like she probably suffocated right away. And back then you couldn't tell if there was DNA inside of her, because that's not where the DNA is found. I don't know now if Tulsa police have taken any of the new instruments like MVAC or Touch DNA and looked at those rape kits, and the problem we have with rape kits. So I don't know if the DNA was ever able to be extracted from there. We did get DNA from 5 different profiles. So.
Oh, wow. So you said you're a trauma psychologist, and you've worked at a women's prison before. So you've worked with people that have done things that they may regret, they may not, depending on the person. I'm kind of curious from psychologically, I mean, what kind of person can commit a crime like what happened to Brittany?
Right. Well, I mean, many people can. The one thing that I know, and I worked at a female prison, and mm-hmm. after a while, I couldn't work there. But the majority of people I worked with were women 50 years and older who very often had taken the crime for their boyfriend or their husband, and they were staying in and he was getting out or whatever. I could never work with men. I mean, I just couldn't, because I didn't know who the perpetrator was. But if somebody had accidentally done it, like, was having sex with her or whatever, and accidentally killed her, the guilt would have gotten to them. And so either that person, if it was accident, is dead, or, it's one reason why we looked at people with drug addictions, because maybe somebody was so guilty about what happened. Generally, when you don't learn about certain type of crimes, and especially sexual predators, they're hardwired, what we call either psychopaths or sociopaths, meaning treatment's not going to help them. Because rape is not a sexual crime. It's a violent crime. Sex is just the tool, the weapon that person uses. So
it's about power.
Yeah, it is. And that's why it just hurts my heart, especially me being a rape survivor from way back in the 70s, when they go, "Oh, if that person wasn't wearing that," or "Why was she there?" or "They were drinking." No, it's a violent crime, and even our legal system doesn't seem to fully understand this, especially here in Oklahoma, that the sexual act is used as one of the weapons and stuff. So what I believe, and again, until we know or don't know, is this is somebody who has a repeated pattern. Years ago in 2007, all the way up till 2016, I worked on getting Oklahoma to pass the DNA at Arrest Act. They passed it at felony arrest, which doesn't catch a lot of people, and then they didn't fund it for 2 or 3 years. But there's a lot of studies, if people ever want to look up, in the Denver study, the Illinois study, Indianapolis study. There's a whole bunch of studies, but what they look at is when a state was only taking DNA at conviction, so people think it's about being convicted. It's not. It's just when they were taking it. And then when they finally got arrested, what happens is they match the DNA backwards, because a lot of rapists get arrested, but the victims are too afraid to testify, so they go back out. And if people want to look up an interesting case that's a perfect example, there's a case called the Ether Man. And the reason I bring it up is because it's about somebody who stayed in Oklahoma for probably more than 16 years, and it was when he was out traveling in New Mexico, which was one of the first states to take it at arrest. This man, his DNA was matched to, and I may have the numbers a little bit wrong, 19 assaults in Norman and 9 in Edmond from about 1986 till, I think, 2007. Again, I might have the dates wrong. But he kept getting arrested. But they never had any evidence. And back then, they didn't really have the DNA. But when some of these states started doing it at arrest, not felony arrest where it has to be a certain type of crime, they were doing some traffic stops and then taking the DNA and putting it in the system. And because a lot of times, even if you have unidentified DNA, it goes into CODIS. Now, a lot of people say, well, but, you can falsely, put it somewhere and somebody can be convicted with it. That happened with our case where we had DNA, we had no evidence, and when Cece Moore, who is part of Finding Your Roots, she actually interviewed the man who does Finding Your Roots to do that, but she also works for Parabon, and she made a direct identification of the first DNA profile from blood and semen, and this is out in the public, so I'm not sharing anything that isn't known. And she made a direct match to it. And that's where we also had that picture, the phenotype picture, which you all have done stories on, where we got a lot of tips, but then sometimes you can't identify the DNA, but she made a direct match, meaning it was only his DNA. Mm-hmm. And because we had no other evidence, he was not even put to trial. He was not assumed our killer.
That was in 2019, wasn't it, when they tested that? And it came back that it belonged to Brittany's best friend's boyfriend at the time?
Yes.
So was he ever, I don't know his name, I haven't looked for it, but was he ever considered a suspect?
Not before that. And not after that, which a lot of us questioned until when I bring you up to space. But the interesting thing is Cece Moore, world-renowned geneticist, made a direct match, not anybody else. All the pieces matched. And this young man was not considered our killer because of the interrogation. TPD, till this day, says, oh, we got all these tips from the picture that was made from his DNA, and from one of the tips, we looked at him, and he's not our killer.
Did they give you a reason?
You get a tip from a picture, and that's not your killer. What are you going to think? You're going to think that picture's still valid.
Yes.
If you say, we matched the DNA to the individual, we went out and got his DNA, and it was the same DNA, and he's not our killer, that's saying that DNA is no longer valid, in so many words. So I still get tips off that picture, just 2 weeks ago, and I always send them to Tulsa police, but it's very confusing. And the second detective who had it, there were some concerns that the interrogation wasn't good. So we still had some thoughts maybe he could be. Until 2 years ago, when I got funding from a podcast that helped us, Murder Squad, Paul Holes, and I got $6,000 to give to Eddie Majors and TPD to send some more to Paragon. Well, first of all, TPD would not let Cece Moore talk. to any media. She had a national show where she was doing 5 different stories on ABC, and she wanted our story there because she wanted to show sometimes you can make a match and it doesn't solve the crime. She felt that was really important. They said no. And so I got him the money, and I thought I was going to go back to Parabon. And for a year, he kept not passing through the paperwork for whatever reason. And then in 2022, I think of August, it might be 2023, he called me one weekend and said, I'm retiring next Monday, and you won't be able to contact me anymore. So for 6 or 7 months, I didn't know where that paperwork was, and I kept pushing. And finally, they did send it off to another group called OTHRAM. And the reason I bring this up is to send another profile off. When they analyzed all the DNA, they found 2 things that were from the boyfriend. When they sent this next, which is already out in the media, the next DNA profile, which I wish I had known before, because why didn't they send it out the first time? With the second detective, it's from underneath the nails. Which, is defensive.
Yeah, defensive.
So, but that didn't match the boyfriend DNA. So we know, if we can identify it, even if we can't, when you say the DNA underneath the nails does not match the boyfriend's DNA, that's where I finally, about a year ago, said, okay, it's not him. I don't have to worry about that anymore. So does that make sense?
Yeah. So did they test that DNA?
So they still have it. So these individuals are not supposed to talk to me because they have a contract with TPD. And that's, it's a chain of custody, all these things that I fully understand. The problem is that at least when Eddie was working with C.C. Moore, he'd keep me a little bit up to date. Well, she tried this avenue and this one, and it just wasn't going anywhere. TPD, other than when they finally got it sent off, 2 years after I got the money, they, other than saying, they've run a couple of names for them, I haven't been told anything. Other than they can be very vague, and I appreciate even the vagueness for some information. So when you do, I don't know how much people know, but with DNA, I never knew anything about DNA, but now I understand it more because
nobody probably knows anything about it until they're put into a situation where they have to.
Well, and then I spent 9 years passing a law, so I needed, when I went in to talk to the lawmakers, I couldn't go, well, I think it's this way, so I really had to. But when, and I just presented at UCO's Forensic Cold Case Conference, and so you just learn more and more all the time. But you start off where the DNA could match anybody across the world. Then you do these different things and try to find some similarities, and then you may be finding a 20th relative. So you're going, okay, well, maybe there's no more Eastern European in it, or maybe there's Asian, or maybe there's Hispanic. But a lot of these populations, minus the white Caucasian, because we're not just using CODIS, we're using certified groups that are the PD can use. And so some of these groups, Asian, Hispanic, some South American, there's a lot of mixed DNA, and it's very hard. And so, I'm told by some people that, they're possibly halfway down, but they don't know. But it's been almost a year or 2 years. But sometimes this one geneticist that I met a couple weeks ago, she said some cases get to what they call maintenance. And if Tulsa police would at least tell me this, then I go, okay, I know it's at maintenance. I don't know if but it's where you've, at this point, run out of cultural trees that you can really investigate. So they'll wait till something else comes up. So I don't know. It's not like CSI. I mean, I wish, on TV they do it and stuff, the other side of it is they're finding a lot of missing. I work closely with NamUs, and they're able to, through family DNA, get that DNA, and then when they have Jane and John Doe's, they're solving it. And the other thing I just want to say is that one reason we got the DNA at arrest law passed is because we got Oklahoma's Innocence Project to understand that DNA at arrest is the other side of helping not only solve crimes, but instead of waiting till somebody's in prison for 20 years, if you have the DNA at arrest, then you can prove they weren't there then. Right now somebody's spending half their life there and then they go, whoops. So it's both keeps predators in early and gets wrongly accused out because it can't be used without other evidence.
So learning that evidence that was originally, found that had belonged to Brittany's best friend's boyfriend at the time, learning that evidence didn't give you the answer to her killer, how did you feel? Were you relieved that it wasn't him? Were you upset that it didn't give you that answer?
Well, I sort of knew they were getting near to it. So I was traveling, and the reason I knew they were getting near to it is that I said, I don't want to be cross-country, and on one of my tours, and then find out that you made a match, and then I have to get back. So I was called when I was in Washington State, and when my detective called, and he said, Maggie, Cece made a direct match. And I'm sitting there going, and now I was thinking, what about going to trial, and what's going to happen? Is she going to be raked over the coals? I started thinking all that way, and then he goes, but he's not our killer. And I felt like somebody had just knocked on my door in the middle of a rainstorm and told me my daughter was murdered, because that was year 18. Yeah. Or 16, I can't do math. But that was, I had lived with the hope, which I have to learn to taper, but I had lived with the hope of maybe we were going to at least get into the next phase, because I'd met so many other homicide families who I was befriending, and they were helping me, and I was helping them, and piece by piece, they were all getting their cases solved. And you sit there. When I train, I go, you can have every emotion like this, and one of them is jealousy. Why? I mean, you can't answer it, but you will go, why can't ours,
Yeah, what's so easy about theirs to solve, but not?
And it's not easy, obviously, but, but it's still, I mean, that's it. The way to heal is accept that you're going to have every single type of emotion. When Brittany was first killed, a lot of her friends' parents were my friends. And for the first year and second year, I had very little contact with them. And I was thinking, these people were my friends. Why couldn't they at least reach out? And what I figured out finally later, about 2 or 3 years after that, was regardless of if I was talking about Brittany, every time they were around me, I was reminding them that their kids were the same age as Brittany, and they could lose them, because we all remember holding our children when they're born, and that first wave of emotion, all that love, but most of us forget that second wave of emotion when we're holding them, and all of a sudden we go, oh my God, what if? And we have to put it out of our brain, and we can't let them live, but we all have that emotion too. And what happened with Brittany's murder is it was kicking up that what if. Now, that's not to say that I figured that out right away, and I wasn't hurt, and I didn't feel abandoned. But, hopefully I let other people understand that, so maybe they go through a little less pain that I had to.
Yeah. Brittany's murder, you've spent all these years looking for answers, but also helping others with their own cases, like you mentioned, and seeing their cases being solved. So tell me about Caravan to Catch a Killer. Like you mentioned that your car has been wrapped with Brittany's photo. How did that come about?
Well, the first team, Jeff Felton, Mike Huff, Mike Nance, Dave Walker, a whole bunch of them, they were turning over every stone. We had hundreds of suspects. And again, I thought it was going to solve it because we had DNA. And Jeff would go, this looks like a great suspect, and he would compare it, and then he'd go, it wasn't a match. He would at least let me into that. And so when it got to be 600 or so, I started trying to send the story out to national news because people were saying, well, Oklahoma is the crossroads. We have I-40, I-44, I-35, goes down to Texas. It goes all the way up to the border. Maybe he's, a serial killer, or maybe he's somebody, And so I try to look into, one, how to get the story across. Two, there really wasn't a lot of communication with police departments about their cases. So I thought maybe just getting it into another city, their police department would, go, oh, that's similar to case, or somebody in their family would be watching the news. And so I started writing and getting no response. Then I started getting some magnets and put them on my car, and it was getting some, and I thought, And it was just around 2007 that you started seeing a few wrapped vehicles. And I was near this place on 71st in Yale, and I saw this beautiful wrapped vehicle. So I found a piece of paper and wrote a note, can you please tell me where you got this done and how we could do it? And that's when, about a few weeks later, I got a call from Travis, the owner of Midwest Wraps here in Tulsa. And he was working then teaching wrapping, which sounds funny, teaching wrapping at the Feller Vinyls Wrap School. And he called me. He said, I have my own wrap company. I also work at Feller's Vinyl teaching it, and they want to donate the material, and I'll donate the artwork. And I was just like, oh, my God, And so he said, get me some pictures, tell me her favorite colors. So I got him some pictures. Sorry. I got him some pictures, and I gave it to him. And about a week later, he said, are you ready to come and see what it's like? And I told him pink and purple were favorite colors. And the wraps have really evolved. I have wrap number 5 now. But I came there, and I started crying because, one, it was pink and purple all over. But Brittany, one of her favorite songs, which her dad, who came up for the funeral, sang, was Butterfly Kisses, from the day she was little. I never told Travis this. He's just, he and his wife and his family, I've watched them grow. But it's a pink-purple background, but if you look closely, it's butterfly wings all over, and he didn't know that. And then, before I gave him the design, I was straining my brain to think of what, I need something, because his truck caught me, and it had something on it, I forget what. And I thought, what can I put up there? And I don't know what I believe in, but I do believe that Brittany helped with this. But I wanted something that would just roll off the tongue, that if people saw it, they could look it up, and that was Caravan to Catch a Killer. And so in 2007, where Lamar Billboard had also donated me a billboard right off on that 244 bypass to go to 44. Under that billboard, I took off on my first caravan, which only had about 5 stories, but it was what I started doing regularly, which was traveling to a quadrant, northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest. And initially, for the first 8 years, it was really about telling her story, and not only telling her story to media, but also to every police department that I went. I would stop and talk to them. And media seemed to really jump on this story. I mean, my first 10 caravans, they were averaging anywhere from 8 to 16 stories, and all I do is find reporters, find what their interest was, write them, email them before I got there, stay there a day after so people could come up to the car after they saw it on the news. And then as I was going on, people would stop me on at rest stops. I would get emails from people who would see me on a mountain in Montana or something. And so I started hearing all these stories, and they were awful, heart-wrenching stories about cold cases just being dropped, or about detectives not talking to the family, or different things like that. And that's when, probably at a year 10, I really started going, people aren't crazy like me. I need to give them a voice. I need to, be their voice too. So I started trying to do more cold case stories. So now it's a mix, but I've done probably, I think, yeah, because I'm going to be doing one in August, but I've done 23 caravan tours through 48 states, covering 300,000 miles. And like I said, this is the fifth carp, and for the first, now I'm comfortable. I just moved here to Tulsa, but for most of the years, if I had a broken water heater, which I did in that Chandler home, or the air stopped working, or I couldn't afford groceries, I would borrow on my cars to be able to do these caravans. I would work overtime, so I had overtime money. I just lived without because it just felt so important, and so I've done these tours all self-funded because I feel awful taking other people's money. Yeah, I know. That's me, being me. But Brittany said you could never argue with Mom about money. So I use that all the time when people want to pay for things. I go, no, Brittany said you can't argue with me, and I say no. But, you asked earlier how I carry this. I would take her back. Especially now I'm 70, I think about how many years I've been without her. And I would take her back in a minute. But the kindness, and it's trite to say, but the kindness of strangers, the people I've met on the road, the people putting their hand in their heart as they're driving by, or like I said, somebody emailing me that they saw me on, coming down a mountain in Vermont. Somebody once flagged me down driving into Montpelier, and it was snowing, and they pulled me off to the side of the road and gave me $50. I have found about the beauty of all these people across the U.S., and it's given me more passion and compassion to all their struggles. But the gifts I've gotten, they're unlike some experiences that anybody else will have. So if nothing else, Brittany has given that to me, and I'm a mom. I'm a very conceited mom who wants her child known all over the world, and because now I have podcasts even in Australia, people do know Brittany, and they tell me, seeing that face looking out from from any of my cars, her deep, dark, back-set eyes around those blonde curls, they tell me that they look at her face and they can't say no to not want to contact me. So, she's the power behind all this.
Would you say that that is a part of what allows you to remain hopeful? Is all of these people that are learning about Brittany and supporting you in your travels, and that and those kind people who stopped you and gave you $50 to continue your caravan? Would you say that's kind of what?
Oh, definitely, And then, too, it's that because they keep me hopeful. And then it's the hope that I give other people by saying, yeah, I thought this was, a dead end. But then because I spoke up, it isn't. Strength comes in numbers. There's a lot of families here in Oklahoma who are struggling with their cold cases. I helped OSBI in 2011 start their cold case support group. And because I live far away from there, I haven't been involved with it, but that's still going strong. I've offered Tulsa Police, but they haven't taken me up on it, so I'm creating my own sort of support group because, it's like anything. You learn from people who have come before you, and if it makes it a little bit easier, then that's the gift what we give. So I have to, being 70, I have to accept that we may never find her killer. I'm going to do it till the day I die because if he is alive and if he didn't do it by accident, history shows that he's doing it still. That's just the history of psychopaths and sociopaths. And so it's not going to make anything different for me, but I'll know at least he's not hurting anybody else. But that is in the middle of the night when I wake up. Sometimes I think, who's going to keep this on after me? And I didn't have to think about that 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So.
Yeah. So you said you're working to kind of create your own support group in Tulsa. Is there a way, if somebody wants to reach out to you, that they would be able to?
Yes. And every so often I'm doing posts. I also run some groups that just get people in. So one of the groups I run is something called Emotional Healing Through Writing. And 2 years ago we had the initial one on her anniversary. And that's where, because I was a poet before I became a psychologist, and poetry and metaphors were my healing. And so now for the last 37 years, I've also used that in my work, so I pulled them in that way. People have contacted me and can contact me, and I assume you'll just put up all these things through my email. On my website page, BrittanyPhillipsMurder.net, right now I'm not on there as much as I am on the Facebook. My telephone number's there. I mean, it is. I've traveled cross country. Nobody's killed me yet. Sorry. People go, how can you do that? But at Facebook is the main place. I mean, that's where I get tips and everything else. And Facebook is mom.missing.Brittany. But I will be posting. Whenever I have an event, I do post it there. But if people want to learn more about it before I post an event, right now I have maybe 2 or 3 families who are interested in the group, and really I want to have a few more just because, reaching numbers is better, and it's free. Anything I do is always, I don't know whether you want to call it pro bono, it's free. I'm always going to do things like that.
And before we go, you were telling me something before we started recording, and I just want to point out to listeners that may not be watching right now, you're wearing some pink sunglasses, some pink camo sunglasses on top of your head. Tell me about these.
Hey, well, Brittany's favorite colors were pink and purple. And on one of my first caravan tours, I was in Florida because she went to college in Florida in St. Pete. And so we had to look at the fact that maybe her killer was there. And, I had bought these sunglasses, and one reporter was setting up to do an interview, and he was saying, well, do you really want to wear those sunglasses? And actually, it was his photographer. He goes, well, they are camo, so those are your warrior glasses. So now, unless they really, really need me to take them off, I don't take them off. And I have to keep rebuying them because I wear them out and stuff. But they are my camo warrior glasses, but of course they're in pink. A lot of it's that symbolism that just helps you go on. People know me for the caravan. People know me for that.
Amazing. Well, anyone with information about Brittany's case is asked to call Tulsa Crime Stoppers at 918-596-COPS. Thank you so much, Maggie, for stopping by and talking with me. I really hope we can get Brittany's case solved soon.
Well, this is such a gift. I mean, every time you tell this story, it increases the chances. So you have a place in my heart, definitely, for doing this.
Oh, thank you.